Hello, welcome. I am so excited for today's lecture. We're just so excited. So welcome and thank you for coming to the third lecture in the North Seattle College Art Gallery's 2021-2022 Visiting Lecture Series. And this is actually the 18th since we began this series last fall. I am Amanda Knowles, the coordinator of the NSC Art Gallery and printmaking and drawing instructor at the art department here at North Seattle College. I'm pleased to work with Karen Stuhldreher, who assists in the gallery. She'll be working behind the scenes here, letting people in. And please thank you for all the work that she does for the gallery that you might not even notice. So thank you for that. We have a live transcript available for those who want it. Those of you who don't want it or find it distracting, you'll see it kind of scrolling along the bottom of the screen. You can turn it off by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting hide subtitle. Use it if you wish, hide it if you wish, but we want to make sure that we have it for those who need it. So I will begin first by sharing my slides and offering some acknowledgements. First, the land acknowledgement. North Seattle College acknowledges that we occupy the former lands of the Coast Salish people, the descendants of the first people of this region. We recognize their long-standing stewardship of this land and that their cultures endure as a valued part of our modern society. We encourage participants to consider their responsibilities to the people and land, both here and elsewhere, and to stand in solidarity with Native, Indigenous, and First Nations people and their sovereignty, cultural heritage, and lives. Next is the labor acknowledgement. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor that created the United States and from which we all benefit. We remember that our nation is built on the labor of enslaved people who were forcibly brought to the US from the African continent, and we recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We acknowledge immigrant labor and recognize that voluntary, forced, and prison labor contribute to the building and ongoing maintenance of our nation. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. Additionally, we acknowledge the critical importance of the work towards racial equity that continues across this country in response to racial injustice and generations of structural racism against BIPOC communities. This next slide shows what we're doing to continue to work to go from acknowledgement to deed. It's not just enough to acknowledge the land and labor, we have to be sure that we're taking action. We show you here what actions North Seattle College and the NSC Art Department are taking to support BIPOC individuals and institutions and to be held accountable. We recommend Real Rent Duwamish, and we will put that link in the chat for you to explore. Thank you. Although we are not yet mounting shows in the art gallery, we're putting together plans to be back in winter quarter, so January 2022. Until then, we are working hard to connect with artists and have them enliven our campus community. Today is the third lecture of the fall quarter. We will have lectures every other Monday at noon. We have 2 more after this. The next lecture will be Natalia Arbeles on Monday, November 22nd. I urge you to visit our website for links to recordings of last year's lectures and a list of upcoming visiting artists. We will post our links in the chat. Okay, on to our visiting artist. It is such a pleasure to introduce you to Kathy Liao. I will begin by saying that every quarter I enthusiastically use Kathy's work to discuss composition with my classes. Well, along with being full of rich emotional content, her work is complex and beautifully composed and a boon to my students as they begin to understand composition. So thank you, Kathy, for your work and for making it easy to do my work. I will read a bit from her bio. Drawing inspiration from her diverse cultural background and personal history, Kathy Liao's mixed media work is about the intimate yet universal concept of relationships. Kathy received her Master's of Fine Arts in Painting from Boston University and her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in Painting and Drawing from the University of Washington in Seattle. She received her BFA in 2008 and since then has shown extensively in group and solo exhibitions both nationally and internationally. I'll pick out just a few. The most recent exhibition was the Charlotte Street Foundation Visual Artist Award exhibition, which opened just this last Thursday at the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas. In 2017, she mounted a beautiful solo show at ProGraphica KD Gallery here in Pioneer Square. She exhibited a self-portrait at the NSC Art Gallery in the show Portrayal, Contemporary Portraiture. Kathy is a recipient of various awards, including the 2020 Charlotte Street Foundation Visual Artists Award, Elizabeth Greenshield Foundation grant, and artist grants and fellowships from Anderson Ranch Arts Center, Vermont Studio Center, and Gentile Artist Residency, just to name a few. Kathy has been the director of painting and printmaking at the Studio Art program at Missouri Western State University and taught at Boston University, University of Washington, Seattle University, and Gage Academy of Art. She's currently part of the Artist Services team at the nonprofit regional arts organization, Mid-America Arts Alliance in Kansas City. I will hand you over to Kathy, but before I do, I want to let the audience know that we will be taking questions in the chat today. So if questions or comments arise during the talk, please write them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to each of them. We will be sending a transcript of the chat to Kathy after the talk. So if you want to comment on the work and her words, please do. You might be specific about what you're commenting on, as she will be probably seeing the words after the talk, but I urge you to support her and her work in the chat. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us, Kathy, and welcome.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see all these familiar faces on the screen as well. Thank you. Before I get started, I do also want to respectfully acknowledge that I am on the ancestral land, occupied ancestral lands of the Osage, Kansa, and the Oceti-Sakowin nations, also known as Kansas City, Missouri. And I am an Asian American woman in my mid-30s with black hair tied back in a ponytail. I'm wearing a blue rimmed glasses, and my background is this warm gray with some artwork in the background. I believe there is closed captioning, so feel free to use it to give you the best experience of this meeting. And I am also conscious that I can be a fast speaker at times. So Amanda, I'm gonna ask you if anyone indicates want me to slow down a little bit, I am happy to do so. So please just let me know. Thank you so much. So again, thank you so much, Amanda, for inviting me to this talk. And I'm excited to share with you all some of the works that I've been working on and some of the thoughts that has gone through my head, especially in this last year and a half. When it comes to putting together this artist talk, I hope this is more of a conversation starter, and I look forward to the Q&A and the conversation that comes afterwards. And I am approaching this talk a little differently this year because I recognize that all of us are living at this point in our lives where we're experiencing the world differently. We're going to class, we're making artwork differently, we're looking at our lives, and even our routine is different. So I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning. So let me go ahead and pull up my slideshow. And please don't hesitate to jot down notes or put questions in the chat. Like Amanda said, I won't be looking at the chat while I'm presenting, so hopefully we'll get to those questions at the end. All right, let me start my screen share. So I want to actually start with this quote by Chie Fueki with her interview with Jennifer Samet. It resonated with me quite a bit recently. And let me read this to you all. There's that famous Philip Guston quote about how you begin in a studio with all of history and your friends, and then one by one, all the people leave. Well, I don't want them to leave. I always hear them. I hear every comment. I hear everybody. It's not only my teachers or art history, the friendship and the dialogue I have with my peers is really important, and I learned so much from them. So I want to start with this quote because, first of all, I love Chie's work, and I'll share a little more about her work later on. And I love this quote because she's basically saying, hey, Guston, you're cool, but I experience things a little differently. I think of how we think of the solitude of the studio, of stripping everything but the work in our studio spaces, I think that is in some way, to me, is a myth. As artists, we are translator of experience. And especially in this day and age, we're bombarded by so much that's happening all around us. I also want to start with this quote because I recognize the importance of my peers, of my lived experience, and what I've learned, my learned history from growing up in Taiwan to then growing up in America, and in all the education I've had. And of course, all the things that's happening around us. So as artists, in creating our work and imagining the futures as well, these are all building blocks of what we do. So I want to start there. And with this slideshow, it is a little bit chronological, but not quite so, because I think a lot about the idea of an origin story and how it's not really just one story, but it's like rooted from so many different things that we experience around us. So I'll start with the portrait, because I feel like many of you are probably familiar with my portraits. So self-portraits is something I do return throughout my entire career. It's where I started, but it's also something I continue to return to. Every year, every new studio space or environment I move into, I make a self-portrait to mark the milestone. And it's a practice I've developed since undergrad. As a young painter, I learned how to paint by studying artists such as Susanna Coffey. I was looking at Lucian Freud at that time and many other figurative artists. I think there's something very, very direct about a portraiture. I'm interested in the emotional impact and in some ways that inescapable narrative that comes with a portrait. And of course, as an Asian American, my identity is written all over my face. And I think that time I was also, this is like during undergrad, I was also noting contemporary Asian artists' work, such as Yue Mingjing from the social realism movement in China. I think at that time and all the things I'm absorbing, I'm just trying to understand where I fit in that continuum of art history. So working with self-portrait, it gave me a vessel, a container, kind of a parameter where it's like the perfect starting block to kind of chip away at it, to explore different techniques, to build up my techniques, to ask questions and to push boundaries. During my undergrad and beyond, I also think of using these portraits to think about the incongruency I experienced as a Taiwanese immigrant here in the States. I moved here when I was a little kid, and I learned really quickly that some things are not like the other. The idea of losing face, of being thick-skinned. As we talk about the racial tension and the white supremacy in America now, I can't help but think back to my grandma's criticism of my American tan and the preference and worship of the white skin in Asian culture. So I do think this is a global issue that we're talking about. When I went to grad school on the East Coast, I got to see a lot of paintings that I only got to study in history books. A visit to the Barnes collection in Philadelphia, I remember being struck by Matisse's Carmelina and de Kooning's seated figure here on the left. I remember being in awe of these paintings and being able to see them in person. And in some ways, during that time, I was internalizing the modernist sensibility. Oh, this one, I remember the bravado and the monumental impact of standing in front of an Anson Kiefer when I visited Masnoka. As a grad student, I was heavily influenced and filled with ambition and possibilities by these work as a young artist. Before I move on, I want to make a point that this is the last reference to an old white man's painting in this slideshow. I'm sharing this because I do want to acknowledge that this is the canon. This is a lot of the work that we studied in art history. This is what I was taught in school. These are the work that heavily influenced my work from a very earlier on, from the scale of the work, the sense of urgency, the expressive gesture, and to a huge degree, that masculinity that exists in some of my earlier work, and that continued to persist in my current work as well. So in some ways, that is something that I am looking internally and digging at that root to figure out where does my work begin, and where is these things that I have come to learn throughout the years. So other works that have influenced me in grad school were Lois Dodd. I love her careful and intimate study of nature, her chasing light in nature, her noticing those fleeting reflections and gestures. You can see her reflection here and in the mirror here. And studying in Boston, New York was super close. So I got to see some of the exhibits that's out in New York. And in 2009, I saw this piece, How We Would Talk by Dana Schutz. And it resonated me quite a bit at that time. Her work has changed quite a bit since then. I've always loved like the meatiness of her work. Now, in many of her recent work, there's a lot of slicing and dicing of the picture plane, which reminds me of kind of that social media space. But this piece really stuck with me. And I'm going to ask you guys to keep this piece in mind, and I'm going to come back to it later on in the slideshow. So you can see how these pieces influence some of my work, some of my self-portraits earlier on. The windows and the grid, the abstraction of the figure. And in some of my later work, the figure almost completely disappeared, replaced by stand-ins. You can see a little bit of an homage to Lois Dodd here in the corner there, and that reflection. As I'm exploring the spaces, so in thinking of portraiture, in some of these pieces, I start to think beyond just a portrait, but really thinking about the environment I exist in. I also want to talk about the influence of printmaking and in building sculptural, hand building pieces in my work. Some of you guys might be familiar with Helen Frankenthaler's paintings. She does these like big, giant color field paintings. But did you know that she also makes these prints? So when I was in New York, I happened upon her woodcut exhibit at the Knoedler Gallery, and I was so mesmerized by these, especially once I realized that each of these pieces are made by layers and layers of 46 wood blocks to create these color field look. So I'm continually in awe of the different possibilities when it comes to printmaking. As I explore different printmaking techniques, it keeps opening new doors, and it continues to keep me in this like amateur state as I'm able to take detours and explore in multiplicity. Other artists that I was really drawn to are Jiha Moon and her paintings and printmakings, and she also does ceramics. So she's very fluid between different mediums. I love the way she brings in iconography and use that as symbols to tell a story, and how that translates through two-dimensionality to 3 dimensions. I was, of course, also very inspired by Akio's work. When I was an undergrad at University of Washington, I got to take one of his ceramic classes in my freshman year, and I don't think I realized what an experience that is until much later on. So Akio's piece is always something that I continue to look back on. And so all these different processes in printmaking and working with building and ceramic pieces, these processes really slow me down and allow me to take many detours. I've always been a really fast painter, so I build, I make painting, I splash on paint, I build, and I adjust and fix by adding more on. But until I started working with these different processes, it really allowed me to think about image making in a very different way. I love being a transformation, being able to start from one image and do something to it and then do something else to it. I think that's coined by Jasper Johns, and printmaking allowed me to do that. So this series is called Collect Calls, and it's a series of 6 prints made with life-size wood blocks. So the wood block itself is as tall as me, of that seated figure. And through various layers of monotype and Shinkolei, which is a collage technique, I'm able to really think about really start to play with be very deliberate, be very conscious about color, about layers, even thinking in transparency versus opacity, thinking about the edges of shape, right? So you can see shapes in here, but you can start to think about what does a hard edge versus a soft edge mean? So those are all different things that come into play as I'm exploring printmaking. And so here's another example where I continue to use the same block, chop it up, and then continue to build with different layers of technique. At the root of printmaking and working with sculptures, it's still drawing. So I do think a lot about what a line does, what a mark does. I think about the gravity of the impression, the gravity of your hand on the surface. So those all kind of come into play in some of my work. This series called Proximity is made with 4-plate aluminum litho. And so on each of the plate, I was building on different types of mark making. And I mentioned about working with multiple. So you can see by playing with color, again, it really allows me to be so much more conscious about why, when, how I'm layering the colors. And so that translates to some of my more recent work. For those of you who are familiar with some of my earlier work, you know that I got a lot of textures, a lot of heavy layers in the painting. But some of these later pieces, all that surface has kind of not so much disappeared, but it got collapsed because I had more chance of thinking through how colors are laying on top of each other, thinking about how light, how luminosity can come through from within the painting rather than being built onto the surface. So inevitably in my practice, I encounter work by Roger Shimamura. I remember seeing his exhibit, Yellow Terror, at the Wing Luke Museum. It must have been 9 years ago. It's been a while. So it's been a while. Yeah, and just being really, I felt it hit me really hard during that time. But at that time, I was still kind of processing why, like, what is all the different things that's happening within his exhibit. I think this last year and a half also has been really hard with racial reckoning, with the pandemic, and the rise of anti-Asian hate. This is part of our history. And for as much as I return to the self-portraits, I do think about how my identity is written all over my face. I devoured Kerry James Marshall's work when I visited a retrospective of his work at LA in the Museum of Modern Art. I love Alison Sarr's pieces and how her seated figure here tells the history of cotton and slavery and how it's growing out of every fiber of her being. I consider the many shades of Byron Kim's Synecdoche, how these artists are considering the skin, the color, and the cultural symbols and archetypes. And I'm fascinated with how they represented or even reconcile with how one is seen through the eyes of other. So this self-portrait and a lot of the figures that come after this comes out of layers of these recognition. This piece is inspired by Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. I'm also thinking about John Berger's way of seeing how women are we're doubly aware of ourselves and how we're seen through the eyes of other as well. This piece is an exercise of stretching, distorting, and wringing out the color yellow. These larger scale self-portraits really zoomed in on my face, and really I started working with collage around this time and thinking about the coming together, the falling apart, breathing in, breathing out, in exploring color palette and mark making and gestures in all of these. I want to share also really quickly the works of Elisa Niesenbaum and Nicole Eisenman. I think the other side of the coin to reflecting what other people see of you is representing your authentic and nuanced experience of being in community with others and in celebrating joy and sharing stories or narrative that's unseen or untold. So on the left here, Eliza worked with different communities. She makes these image of these really intimate moments. And Nicole as well, thinking about these scenes of her community gathering together. I feel like I get transported into these intimately specific and relatable space within their paintings. So their paintings really resonate with me in thinking about what type of story that I want to tell. What is my community and how I relate to people around me? The one on the right here is actually a painting of my mother. She's a dentist. So I really think about that space that I experienced between her and myself when I'm sitting on a dental chair and she's shining, exposing this light on me, that air between us in a very, very, what's the word? Kind of the way that kind of sends a little tingle down your spine. And in some of my more recent work, this piece is called Without, right? Thinking about that relationship between my father, my mother, my grandma, and how they share the space they exist in. And I'll talk a little more about that as well. So before I dive into some of my more recent work, I do want to share this video with all of you. It's by the poet Elizabeth Acevedo performing the Rat Ode. So let me go ahead and play this.
When a lot of people think about poetry, they think it can only be about deer and flowers and the clouds, right? They think it's inaccessible. It's not about the experiences we have every day. And so this professor goes on and on about deer, because grad school classes are long. And he goes one step further. He says, I want everybody in the room to write an animal ode, right? And an ode is a praise poem. It's a poem that elevates an ordinary thing to a different height. So he goes to one classmate, he's like, what would you write about? And my classmate is like, well, like Elizabeth Bishop, I would write about the blackbird. 13 Ways How to See a Blackbird is a very famous poem. This person was not being original, right? I'm like, okay, you're a biter. He goes to another classmate. My classmate's like, I would write about sea anemones. And I'm Googling on the table like, what the is a sea anemone, right? Like, why would you write about that? Too original. And then my professor gets to me. And the one piece of writing advice you always get is write what you know. And I told y'all where I'm from. Y'all here in New York. You know what creatures we got around. And so I'm hype. I'm like, this is a good answer. I'm like, I would write about rats. And I feel good, right? Like, you know, Family Feud, good answer, good answer, good answer. I was waiting for like my applause. And in this space that I often felt that I should not speak up, this professor laughed at me. And he said, rats are not noble enough creatures for a poem. I think you need more experiences, Liz. And this was not a man who was like inherently insidious. This is not a man who had done me wrong in any other capacity. This was someone who we would call a good man and a fine poet. But in that moment, this was a man who told me my story was not worthy of being on the page. Because it's not just about the rat, right? It's about that the different symbols we have in our lives that we never see in books, we are then told not only can we not see them, we also cannot write them. We are erased even from our own narrative. And so I wrote this poem. It's my official clapback to that professor. It's called Rat Ode. And it serves as a reminder for any of us who have ever been told our story is too small or too ugly or too different for high art, that we are all of us deserving of poetry. So this is for the rats in the room. Because you are not the admired nightingale. Because you are not the noble doe. Because you are not the picturesque ermine, armadillo, or bat. They have been written and I don't know their song the way I know you're scuttling between walls. The scent of your collapsed corpse rotting beneath floorboards. Your frantic squeal as you pull at your own fur from glue traps, ripping flesh from skin in an attempt to survive. Because in July of '97, You birthed a legion on 109th, swarmed from behind the dumpsters, made our streets infamous for something other than crack. Shit, we nicknamed you Cat Killer. Raced with you through open hydrants, squeaked like you when Siete blasted aluminum bat into your brethren's skull. The sound slapped down dominoes. You reigned that summer rat, and even when they sent exterminators, half dead and on fire, you pushed on, because even though you are an inelegant, simple, mammal bottom feeder, always freaking famished little ugly thing who feasts on what crumbs fall from the corners of our mouths, you live uncuddled, uncoddled, can't be bought at Petco and fed to fat snakes because you are not the maze rat of labs. Pale, pretty-eyed, trained, you raise yourself, sharp fang, clawed, scarred, patched dark because of this. He should love you. But look at the beast, the poet tells me. The table is already full, and rat, you are not a right-worthy thing. Every time they say that, take your gutter, your dirt coat, filth this page, rat. Scrape your underbelly against street concrete. You better squeak and raise the whole world, rat. Let loose a plague of words, rat, and remind them that you, that I, we are worthy of every poem. Here.
Yes. Yes, I am so thankful for her words. And I'm sharing this also because I'm born on the year of the rat. So I feel it very deeply. I want to share this with all the students and the artists in the room who are questioning or asking, exploring your own story, your own personal symbols, and wondering whether it's noble enough. And the answer is always yes. So this segues to some of these artists I felt kinship with. This is Chris Ng, and I love her work. The way she notices the mundane. What may seem ordinary from others' eyes, from her lived experience, these relationships become meaningful. I love that sourdough bread next to that bowl. Like there's something about it. Yes, I relate to that. Similarly, with my friend Yumi Nam pieces, she's a printmaker who teaches at the University of Kansas, who is also my studio mate. So she's amazing. I love the way she creates these lyrical lithography of delicate flower arrangements that's emerging out of these like instant noodle cups and frivolous Five Guys cups. Like there's something incredible about those juxtaposition. And I also want to return to Chie's pieces as well. Her work sings to me. I love her interest in symbols and motif and metaphorical icons that floods and just overwhelms the surface. In her own language, it's a love letter to herself. So again, your story, your experience is worthy and nothing is not noble enough. So then what is my story to tell? So this is something I've been thinking a lot in recent years. I want to start by telling you the story of the wind telephone, Kaze no Denwa. It's a wooden telephone booth with a black rotary dial phone like this that's connected to nothing. And this telephone booth sits on top of a hill overlooking the city of Otsuchi. And that's where the tsunami swept through. And after the tsunami, people will come from all over Japan to speak into the Kaze no Denwa, hoping their words will be carried by wind and be heard by their loved ones. It's a way of communication, it's a way of reaching across far distances, a way of connecting that I understand too well. I grew up in two countries, in Taiwan and here in America, and I'm very aware of that distance between my Taiwan home and my America home. My grandma and my mom still lives in Taiwan. For 15 years of my life, this distance is bridged by my father who traveled back and forth between the two countries. This series, coming back to this, as you can tell with the name Collect Call, it kind of dates it. It's about the experience of picking up my dad's phone call every day of my life when he dials these collect calls from Taiwan to talk to me, to touch base with me. My dad called me every day for 15 years. And so he became that voice on the other side of the telephone. My dad has since passed away. And I would still have conversations with him, letting him know that I am doing well. I'm working really hard, so please don't worry about me. Living in Kansas City, I live in Kansas City now, and my family never felt further apart from me. Prior to the pandemic, I would take these really long distance flights, I think close to 20 hours from like Kansas City to San Francisco and then flying over there. These long flights to Taiwan. And I think the space between one destination to another is like a space of limbo, neither here or there. So this moment caught my attention when the flight attendant announced that we're about to land. There's always, for me, there's this anticipation that kicks in of turning a switch, trying to prepare myself for a different set of language, a different set of culture expectations, trying to remember my aunt's name, right? So all these things, all these emotion bubbles up in that moment. My father used to travel back and forth between Taiwan and the US every 3 months. And I remember him constantly packing and unpacking luggages. His dream is to eventually move to the US and live here with us. And this packing and unpacking become this ritual for him. And throughout the years, he kept bringing things from Taiwan, objects, like a picture, all these things from Taiwan, hoping to make the American home feel more familiar and more comfortable. So I think a lot about how we hold on to memories and how these memories do morph and change with time. This piece is called Sunbathing, and it's actually done in life. I caught my dad one day sitting out in the backyard in California. So I quickly grabbed my collage materials and put together this drawing. And maybe because of that, this image, this memory is etched into my brain, almost like a snapshot. And so in coming back to this memory over and over again, years later, when I try to recreate it in an image, all I remember was this bright, blinding California sunlight that day that overwhelms my memory. And then thinking about how memory shifts and change. More recently, when I revisit that memory, figures and faces blurred. And to me, in some ways, the absence compels me in terms of, rather than forcing something to be there, being okay with the change. As I think about memory, I've been tracing my grandma's memory. So I'm sure all of you guys are super familiar with these screenshots of engagement with your family, hopefully, right? Thinking about these long distance relationships. This is my grandma. I call her 外婆 in Chinese. And even before the pandemic, I've been connecting with my grandma through FaceTime. She lives in Taiwan. My grandma has dementia, so her memory is slipping. And so for me, being a witness from so far away, watching her memory disappear is hard for me, but I really cherish these moments that I can connect with her. You can see that besides her losing her memory, the confusion on her face, she's also super confused about this technology as well. So in this piece, I do think about that relationship. Like the piece is titled So Close and So Far, because I do think about that juxtaposition of seeing my grandma's face on this format. She feels so close to me, and our faces right next to each other, but recognizing that distance between her and I. And I'm not there. I'm not in Taiwan to hug her, touch her, to give her that embrace. And every family deals with dementia differently. Back in Taiwan, when I visit, I love seeing all these different notes across my little tiny Taiwanese apartment. My mom would put up signs across the apartment telling my grandma, don't open doors to stranger, don't forget to turn off the gas. And this is an image of that says, do not touch the switch. So there's like different signs and labels all around the house. And so in making this piece, I think one thing that really like touched me was when I see signs in the house that says, it's okay if you can't remember. And so this piece is kind of an homage to that, and thinking about all the little touches that we do, the things that we leave around the house for those we love. When I do visit Taiwan, usually there's that sense of jet lag. So usually the first 3 days, I'm like up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. And one of the memories that really stuck out to me is once in a while, I'll catch my grandma up in the middle of the night, wandering the hallways, moving things here and there, moving things around. I think similar to my dad's ritual of packing and packing, my grandma is moving things, putting things back to where it feels familiar to her once upon a time. So this piece is called Balcony. I do in all of my work, as Amanda mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, thinking about composition. In all of my work, I think about the division of spaces, and it comes through in my composition and my color choices here and there, whether it's inside or outside. And so the gesture of the figure tells a story as well. So in translating that distance between my grandma and I in a lot of these sculptural pieces, and in this is a ceramic piece, oftentimes my grandma is just that little bit out of reach. Oftentimes she's just turned away, out of reach. I can feel that distance between my grandma and I, and how it's kind of pulling further and further apart. In this piece, when I see her down the hallway, sometimes she would hide, not knowing who I am. But when I do see her, she always gives me, I think I missed that slide. There's this image of my grandma when she does see me, she would give me the most amazing smile. So in many of my pieces, I do think about that idea of a touch. Like I mentioned before, being so far from my grandma, I'm not there to touch her. But when I do see her, this piece is called Fortune Telling, because one of the first things she does when she does see me is she would grab my hand and trace the lifeline on my hand and telling my fortune. And she does this to every stranger she meets. I think for her, just touching the hand gives her that point of connections. And when she does look up, she will usually give me the most amazing smile. I'm like, yes, when she does remember me. So in this recent pandemic, I do think about the different distance that we experience, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional. I also think about, like I mentioned before, the gesture of how we can be in such proximity of space and also feel really distant at the same time. How casual and instant gratifying a tap or swipe is versus the physical impression of a squeeze of a hand. This bizarre interaction we have with each other nowadays. This is an image of my mom. It's called Korean Drama Lullaby. She escaped to Korean drama. I don't know how many of you guys actually watch Korean drama, but she would fall asleep to them almost as a way of escape. In many of my recent wall drawings and paintings, I do document these fluid states of memory, experience, and a sense of place. And I do think about the layering of memory as well. My grandma, as she's losing her memory, I feel like there is that kind of returning to the child. And I learned a lot of my grandma's story through my mom's retelling of it, and of course, of my personal lived experience. So I do think about that layering within my pieces. So as we're approaching the end of the slideshow, I do want to share a little bit of my studio practice. So these are some of the stuff that's happening on my studio wall right now. My studio is a giant mess. And this is a little bit of the process of how I work with collage. So I make these large gestures and I build these in. And here is an installation shot of one of my more recent shows. So it takes a village. I can't do this by myself. So I have a lot of helpful interns and supporters that help me install these work. And of course, museum handlers, they're so professional, they're amazing. And so this piece is installed currently at the Nerman Museum called In Between the Lines. Like Amanda said, the show just went up last week. And here's a detail of it. So you can see from afar, it looks like this. I was really interested about kind of that endless custom border security line that we often end up when we're traveling. So here's a cluster of a figure, and you kind of see how they come together here in this detail. And since it just opened last Thursday, I'm a terrible person when it comes to documenting my show. So these are pictures from my friends who were able to snap some shots from the opening. So you can see how these pieces are installed in the space. This piece is the newest piece I just finished in my studio called Liao. It's made with 6 giant wood panels. And you can kind of see the sense of scale of my friend standing in front of it. I'm happy to talk a little more about what the title means in Q&A, but I do want to quickly get through some of the last few slides. And there's me trying to install that giant piece in the space. And so in many of my work, I really do think about how my family is very much part of me, and I find comfort in the patterns and the rituals that weave through the way I interact with my family members. I want to kind of close this slideshow with a picture of my father, so you can kind of see that custom border security line behind it as he's getting into ticketing. I was sharing the story of the wind telephone because I do think about the word. I think the word nostalgia come up in my work quite a bit, and I'm kind of feeling conflicted about the word. Until recently, I read an article by Michael Chabon in the New Yorker magazine titled "The True Meaning of Nostalgia," and it struck me this one quote he wrote. So I'll share that with you. For all that we do as artists, we're hoping to find that moment of connection when we place a phone call directly into the past and hear an answering voice. It reminds me of the way those Japanese family connects with their loved ones through the wind telephone. I don't know if we have time, but I would like to share one last poem. I love poetry, so I want to share this one last poem by my friend Waskar Medina. He is the current poet laureate of Kansas, and let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Waskar Medina. I'm the current poet laureate of the state of Kansas, and this is my poem, Nobody But You. I wish for a time when every other poem isn't about our bodies, not about creating space for our bodies, not about rediscovering displaced bodies, not about accepting rejected bodies, not about reclaiming stolen bodies, not about healing bodies, not about saving dying bodies, not about mourning murdered bodies, not about the body politic. I wish for a day when every poem's for everybody, and I can write you a love poem without loathing the fact it won't save anyone outside of us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for letting me share my work and the things I've been thinking about. And thank you for sharing this space with me. Q&A. Let's just talk.
We're doing a Q&A. I'm sorry, I had too many things to manage at the moment. I also had tears in my eyes, so it was sort of hard to do all of those things. I hope that you all will be putting stuff in the chat. There's some things in there that I will read out. Also, if maybe we might be able to use our voices, I just want to honor that you are here and all of that stuff, and not put anybody in a, oh, there's tons of stuff popping up. Okay. I am going to start with a question of mine, because that's the kind of girl I am. So I got the privilege of researching and reading more about your work, more than I knew before this talk, in creating the introduction. And in an essay by Michelle Tyreen Johnson, she wrote, though her medium is oil painting, Liao's work feels and reads like a photographic image of a moment and the emotion present within that moment. And my question is, can you talk about the relationship of photography and your work just a little bit? And this is so selfish of me, because this is like everything that I'm interested in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Michelle is a good friend of mine, and I feel like other people always write so much better about my work than I can write it myself. I think that's a great comment. I think photography first of all, I just want to say I'm a terrible photographer. I can't take a good photo for the life of me. But I have been using the iPhone, or just like these digital technology we have with us, to capture like moments that struck me, right? Sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's something that like, there's something about this I don't want to let go. As you saw with that one slide of my grandma, I feel like even in my conversation with her in the last couple of years, I just like, screenshot, I'm like, grandma, screenshot, so those are in some ways, I think maybe the way to answer this question is, these photo images are a resource. So it is not so much like I am recreating the image or recreating the moment or recreating that feeling, but it is just like, here is a note of that moment. And then so as I'm building my images, most of the time, many times, it's not just the image itself. The image may be a starting point, but then layers of like, I feel that way around that time. There's this weird, eerie, light in that moment, or there's this other memory that kind of seeps in, or so those are all the different layers that does start to build on top of it. So it's rarely just like a recreation of that moment. And like I mentioned before, it changes, right? So it could be, I may be feeling some way when I took that snapshot, but now after 2 years, 3 years, my lived experience has been layered on how I see that moment. So that all gets built in, or attempt to get built into the image itself. So.
Sorry, I'm just going to take that one step further because I can.
Sorry, yeah,
but I am the worst I take tons and tons and tons of iPhone pictures too, and like I always think I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to, be back here. Do you have that same thing, or are you constantly going through? Are you constantly buying the like extended terabytes of storage space for this, or do you have an organizational system that makes sense?
I don't. I think if I remember correctly, I have like 5,000 something photos on my phone. It's terrible. I do start like putting them into folders when I can, but there's also moments where like I feel a little stuck in my work. I just like start, scrolling through, and then something, whether it's like a color or like there's a moment or there's a gesture that stand out, and then I take a pause, and then sometimes that would seep into my work again. So no, I am not a very organized artist in general. I am the type of artist that makes a giant mess, and in chaos, something comes together. So no, I do not have a system.
Thank you. Urania asks, are all these paintings in oil or some in acrylic? And that also the comment, great work, makes me think a lot, so.
Thank you. Rania, I think I started out as an oil painter, so I do a lot of paintings in oil earlier on, but now my work is a little bit all over the place. A lot of those like giant wall pieces, they're actually paper, so they're made on paper, and there's a freedom to that where oftentimes I would start out with an idea, with an image, and because of the medium paper itself, it allows me to continue to grow and add and expand. And I also have the freedom to like cut back and like think about composition. So some of the larger wall installations are done on paper. The most recent piece is actually a mix of acrylic and oil. So it is, I started with acrylic and then finished it with oil. So lots of different ones. And also encaustic, I started working with encaustic in some of my pieces as well. So lots of different combination of things.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's so much appreciation for you in the chat. It's really hard to go through and find questions. So I'm gonna continue looking for that, but just a lot of, appreciation for your work, for explaining something that people might consider like too dear, like very close to the heart stuff. My heart's over here actually, but in a way of explaining your work, which is interesting that they're tied so much together that you can't not talk about these things. And I find that really interesting. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about at all, but that just like that in every time you talk about your work, which is like, it's actually the work that you do, you have to talk about sort of your emotional life and
Yes.
this, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a level of vulnerability to that. And I think it is an acknowledgement that that we're constant, you know, I do think there is a way, like, you know, I can do work, I can like separate the different, like compartmentalize that. But at the same time, I feel like what motivates me, or what like gets me into the studio a lot of times is these imageries that is so dear to my heart. So yeah, Amanda, I think you're right. If they are intricately tied together, so it's hard not to talk about them without just being able to speak to my personal experience. And kind of like what I mentioned in the talk, it is those nuanced lived experiences that, right, recognizing that we're like, all Asian American is not a monolith, and all our experiences is so different, and it's being able to share that little subtle difference in experiences that I think that's where I see my work exist in.
I love it. There's a lot of just amazing things that you'll get as we send you this chat. Kelly says, and I'm kicking myself for not buying more at your studio sale before you left. Dumb. Yeah, just a lot of love going on.
Thank you, Kelly. Amanda, would you be open for people to just unmute themselves and ask questions, or?
Absolutely, yeah. Please.
I'm like seeing 56, like the number 56 in the chat, and I have no idea what's going on in there. So if you have a question. Like,
yeah, exactly.
I think
there's a question, Shakira, you might want to ask this because I don't, what studio is your work at? Are you asking for a gallery?
Gallery, studio, where is your work being presented that we can go like be in the presence with your work to feel that energetic space?
Yeah.
We have to fly.
Thank you, Shakira. I currently work out of Kansas City. So my studio is here in Kansas City at Studio Zinc, which is a 3-year residency program I've been part of. Here's a huge difference between working in the Midwest and Seattle. My studio space is the size of a basketball court, so which give me the wall space and the, you know, just the room to be able to experiment, have different stations, have different work going on at once. And for me to be really ambitious with some of the work I'm making. Although I'm kind of questioning, like, why are my work so big? So that's a completely separate question. So I don't have any upcoming exhibits in Seattle right now. So maybe some of you guys can bring me back there somehow. But my work is at the Nerman Museum Contemporary Art in Kansas City right now. I will have another exhibit in Missouri, solo exhibit in Missouri in January. And then I'm out in New Hampshire at the Museum New Art that's coming up next year. So I'm all over the place, just not quite in the Northwest at this very moment.
Thank you for sharing. We need to get you back out here. So we definitely
If you ever travel through Kansas City, let me know. You're always welcome in my studio space.
Thank you.
Our own Kara Richardson asks, from the Midwest, how has living in the Midwest influenced your work?
Significantly, I think significantly. I came to Kansas City back in 2014 for a teaching position. So I was in academia for the last 6 years or so until recently. Now I work at Mid-America Arts Alliance, and I do professional development for artists. There's something incredible about building community here in Kansas City and being part of and growing the arts ecosystem here in Kansas City. And also recognizing, so this is a part that I feel my work has changed a lot in terms of the way I think about my work, where I see my work in the community I exist in, partly also because there's not a lot of Asian American artists out here in Kansas City. I feel like I am working in some ways in a vacuum. That deep-rooted sense of longing and like distance between my connections is really, really true. Like it feels really poignant in my work, because I do feel like, whether it's in St. Joe, Missouri, a little rural town here in Missouri to Kansas City, there's not a lot of conversation that could be happening around my experience, my work, and which gives me a much stronger urge to like get these stories out and, you know, talk about my lived experience. So yes, it has influenced my work greatly, and also made me like dug my heel down, like I need to share this, I need to talk about this. And so yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it has changed my work. When I first came to Missouri, I was like, whoa, the sky is so big, like, you know, the field is incredible. But now I feel like, especially in the last year and a half, it's very introspective. It's really coming back to here.
Thank you.
That also brings us
Thank you, Kara.
That also brings us to like the question of how you experienced the pandemic. I mean, in some way, you know, I guess if you want to kind of go through that.
Yeah. The pandemic. I was just having a conversation with Amanda earlier and really thinking about how the pandemic has affected all of us so differently. I shared a little bit with Amanda that I was teaching for 6 years, and right up to the pandemic, I got let go. That position went away. And so it besides the fact that pandemic stopped everything, my career came, like, you know, my whole identity as an art educator came to a full stop. So I think that had a huge impact in the momentum of my work, how I think about my work, even just questioning why I'm doing the work I do, what difference does it make, what, you know. So it was paralyzing. And I think as all of us like follow each other on social media, it feels like there's always something going on. But I think the reality and being vulnerable about it too is I was paralyzed for almost 6 months of like just not knowing why I'm in the studio space. Some of the pieces I was working on, that last piece I showed of Liao, that whole painting was of a crowded airport scene, because that was kind of the theme I was following at that time, right before leading up to the pandemic. And I stared at that piece for 6-7 months, like almost up to a year. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't understand this. This is not comprehending. And the current iteration is like this lonely figure. So it took me a long time to process, to digest of our experience during this time. The pandemic did allow me to kind of experiment with new mediums. I was working with ceramic, working with sculpture, and really taking my ideas in different direction. But for a while, I was paralyzed, and it's okay, right? Kind of like my grandma, it's okay not to remember. It's okay to not be prolific, not to be making work as life is happening around us, right? But that does come back. That does come back to the work.
Sue wants to know what's next. What's the next body of work? I mean, after that, like you process. I mean, that's sort of a nice segue where you go from like maybe nothing to like figuring it out, and like what is headed, where it's headed next. Yeah,
thank you, Sue. I have to admit, I think this last show at the Nerman was kind of a floodgate for me. I felt like my work I was paralyzed for a while, and I felt like I was experimenting and like taking tons of detours, just trying to figure out like how to keep myself grounded and like trying to figure out what I'm doing. In the pressure of having to put this show together, I felt like that bottleneck has been released. And so I feel very excited to be back in the studio. I am trying to be conscious of like why I'm making these giant pieces. Part of it is I do think some of these experiences are so monumental, and having to express that and having like a space for someone for the viewers to be able to like immerse themselves and walk into. I think that was part of the motivation, but also recognizing that some of these experiences are so intimate, and why not bring it back, so thinking of that. So Sue, I feel very open right now and excited to be back in the studio. And so I don't have a concrete, like, this is the next project I'm working on, but I feel like there's lots of thread that I can tug and follow along in the next few months. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Sue.
It does. It's great to hear that you're excited about the direction that's coming.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd love to have you in my studio one of these days, but I'm so far away.
Yes.
I think this is a great time. I know there's more questions. It's a great time to stop the recording. I want to thank you for spending time with us. Thank you so much for your story, just the depth of that story. So thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for being here with me and really for sharing this virtual space with me. Thank you.